In the quiet, soot-smudged hills of Towdy, Kentucky, the year 1834 passed much like any other. The roads were muddy, the tobacco crop was good, and the thunder of horses' hooves echoed more reliably than church bells. But in a weathered farmhouse just outside Elkton, a child, or rather, two, were born that would perplex not only their parents and neighbors but generations of doctors, ministers, and scientists to come. This is the story of the Bledsoe twins. Or perhaps it's the story of a single person with two names. No one could ever really say for sure. To be clear, twins were not particularly rare in the 19th century. Large families were common, and though infant mortality was high, multiple births happened with little fanfare. But these twins were different from the very beginning. For one, they shared a single body, one torso, four limbs, but two heads that spoke with startling independence. What you and I would now call dicephalic parapagus twins, a rare type of conjoined twins, was in 1834 viewed with a mix of theological suspicion and crude curiosity. The local midwife who delivered them, an aging woman named Widow Harker, nearly dropped the newborns in fright, muttering a string of prayers as she backed away from the blood-soaked sheets. Their mother, Martha Bledsoe, was too weak to speak. Their father, Ephraim, a stern and lanky man with Methodist convictions, reportedly didn't say a word for 3 days. They were named Elbert and Albert. Elbert had the left head. Albert had the right. No one remembers who came up with the names. But some said it was a joke. The family never did agree on how many children they actually had. The twins' condition forced the family into isolation, not out of shame but sheer practicality. In rural Kentucky, where most homes sat a mile or more apart, word of their birth traveled like molasses in winter. Most locals didn't believe it. Those who did wanted proof. And when they finally saw the twins, reactions ranged from stun, silence to prayers for the devil's retreat. Elbert and Albert were, in many ways, entirely different people. Albert loved music. He hummed constantly, tapping fingers to unheard rhythms. Albert hated noise and often yelled when his brother drummed on their shared leg. Albert preferred bacon. Albert liked eggs. They bickered like any siblings, but their arguments were unavoidable. They shared lungs, a stomach, and a bladder. If one got sick, the other suffered. If one stayed awake, the other couldn't sleep. By the time they were 6, their differences were undeniable, and yet so was their cooperation. They could walk slowly and with effort. They learned to read. And in one of the more curious episodes recorded by a traveling tinker who visited the family, the boys memorized entire pages of a hymnal, each one reciting alternating verses. Their mother, Martha, kept detailed notes in a diary, a rare document that would later become the centerpiece of medical interest. She wrote, "Albert dreams of steamships. Albert prays each night for separate souls. I do not know how to love them apart." In that sentence lies the heart of the mystery. Were these two boys, or one? By the 1840s, word had spread far beyond Kentucky. A doctor from Cincinnati visited and attempted to conduct a study. He asked questions Albert wouldn't answer. He measured limbs Albert refused to move. He left frustrated, claiming they were willfully uncooperative. But really, they were just boys' independent minds trapped in a shared anatomy, wary of outsiders who treated them like livestock or sideshow attractions. And the offers began rolling. P.T. Barnum himself is believed to have sent a letter. He wanted to showcase them, promised a salary, promised dignity, promised medical care. Their father tore the letter in half and tossed it in the hearth, but not everyone could ignore the curiosity. In 1848, the twins, then 14, were forcibly examined by a group of traveling physicians who were given access through a distant uncle. The results were published in a medical journal in Boston, under the title, Anatomical Curiosities of the Western Frontier. The report is still preserved today and contains phrases like dual cognition and shared reflexive systems with Cognitive individuation. In short, it means this. Albert and Albert weren't just two heads. They had separate dreams, fears, and wills, yet their nervous systems weren't entirely separate. If one was pinched, the other flinched. If one laughed, the other sometimes wept. And so came the preacher's doubt in 1852. A circuit rider from Nashville came to save them. He preached hellfire. He insisted they be baptized, and when they refused to be baptized separately, he declared their souls confused and possibly condemned. Others followed, drawn not by compassion, but by spectacle. One Baptist preacher asked if they each sinned separately. Another wondered aloud if in death they would be judged as one entity or two. Their mother's diary notes on this time are sparse, but one line stands out. They are more afraid of being unloved than being unwhole. The twins themselves reportedly avoided church after that. They stayed mostly at home, built birdhouses, learned to carve, and in one odd summer, took up amateur astronomy with a broken telescope given to them by a cousin. By 1860, the Bledsoe twins were adults, or at least as close to adulthood as society would allow. They could not marry for legal reasons. They could not own property in both names for logistical ones. They could not enlist, although Albert once tried to register for the draft, causing a bureaucratic panic that nearly reached the state capitol. And they began to ask questions themselves. What if one died before the other? What would happen to the body they shared? Could one head survive while the other decayed? The answers weren't just hard to find, they were impossible. Even today, medical science cannot fully explain their case. Most dicephalic parapagus twins do not survive infancy. Fewer still live into their 30s. None, to current record, have ever been documented with such extreme cognitive separation, combined with physical synchrony. But in 1864, during a particularly wet spring, something happened that brought the Bledsoe twins' story into a strange, tragic climax, something no one in Todd County was prepared for. The rain in the spring of 1864 fell for 11 days without pause. In Todd County, Kentucky, this was not especially unusual. The red clay roads became impassable, boots stayed muddy, and mules refused to pull carts over soggy fields. The Confederate and Union armies were still locked in the final years of the war, though the fighting had mostly moved eastward. The Bledsoe farmhouse remained standing, weathered and moss-streaked, about 2 miles down from a creek that had long ago forgotten its banks. It was during this season that something subtle and terrifying changed within the Bledsoe twins. Account begins once again in Martha Bledsoe's aging diary, March 31st. Albert awoke before Elbert. This has never happened. Until then, the twins had always woken together. Their sleep cycles, though occasionally disturbed, were generally in sync. But on this day, Albert opened his eyes at dawn, while Elbert did not. His brother's head slumped slightly to the side, lips parted, breath shallow but even. When Martha came into the room, Albert was weeping. "I think he's dreaming something terrible," he whispered. Martha waited. She watched. But Albert did not stir. He remained that way for nearly 16 hours. Local doctors were summoned. Again, this time not with tape measures and pamphlets, but with grave concern. They examined Albert, his pulse steady, his pupils reactive, no fever. Albert remained alert and frustrated, trying to help. "He doesn't answer," he said more than once, "but he's there. I know he's still there." No cause was found. No trauma, no illness. Just silence from the left side of the twins' shared body. Then, without warning, Albert woke. He seemed confused, unsettled, but unharmed. When questioned about the experience, he had no memory of the day before. He claimed he had been in a place with no windows. He said it had been dark and too quiet. This pattern, one waking, the other dormant, would happen again. And again. By June, it had happened 6 times. Word traveled, slowly but insistently. A professor from Ohio came to observe. He had read the Boston Medical Journal article from years earlier and believed this new symptom offered some opportunity to study alternate cerebral dominance in merged neurology. He stayed 3 days. He left with more questions than he came with. What fascinated observers most was how the body of the twins behaved during these episodes. When Albert was awake and Albert asleep, they could still walk, though clumsily. Albert could feed them. The heart rate, breathing, digestion, these systems remained normal, but one eye would not blink. One hand would not grasp. The face would hang slack. It was not a coma. It was not sleepwalking. It was something entirely outside the understanding of mid-19th century medicine, and perhaps even our understanding today. Martha's diary again provides the most intimate insight. I see the light go out in one eye, and the other looks back at me in fear. I want to say it's temporary, but I cannot. For the first time, the question of consent arose. What happens if one twin agrees to something the other does not? What if one wants surgery, or treatment, or prayer, and the other refuses? What if one falls in love? Can the other opt out? Up until now, such questions had been philosophical. But in 1864, they became real. One of the visiting doctors, a young man from Louisville named Dr. Elwyn Pierce, suggested a drastic intervention: separation. He had read of an 1850s case in France where partially conjoined twins were surgically divided. He believed it might be possible if they could determine how many vital organs were shared. The twins had never undergone internal imaging, of course. There was no X-ray, no anesthesia. Surgery was a bloody, dangerous, and often fatal procedure. Even minor infections killed. Dr. Pierce believed the recurring dissociation of Albert and Albert might be due to neurological interference, that one brain was somehow pulling from the body more strongly than the other. He believed a surgical separation might liberate both individuals. Albert refused. Albert, strangely, agreed. And here, the full horror of their condition became apparent. There was no legal framework for such a decision, no precedent, no way to determine whose voice had more authority, especially when both voices came from the same rib cage. The proposal was abandoned. Dr. Pierce left. But the question lingered. Through the rest of 1864, the twins became more reclusive than ever. The war ended the following year, but few in their area celebrated. The Bledsoes had lost cousins on both sides. The community around them had changed. Their father passed away in 1866, a quiet death, according to the record, with little ceremony. The twins were now in their 30s, functional, intelligent, and completely outside the world. Albert had taken to writing. He began composing long reflective essays, some about faith, some about the experience of being half of a person. Many of these writings have been lost, but 2 were preserved in a small Methodist college archive in 1921. One fragment reads, "It is like living in a room where the wall speaks back. He is me and he is not me. I want him near and I want him gone. God forgive me." Albert, on the other hand, spoke less. He reportedly spent most of his time observing birds through the window and had developed a hobby of charting their patterns with colored chalk. Their lives were not miserable, but they were profoundly limited and increasingly haunted by the fear that whatever was happening between them, this cycle of dissociation, was worsening. It was in 1870 when the most dreadful thing happened. Albert did not wake. He had gone into one of his dark quiets, as Albert called them, and simply never returned. After 3 days, Albert stopped eating. After 5, he demanded the doctor come. After 8, he begged the preacher for last rites. No one knew what to do. Was Albert dead? Was Albert still alive? Could the body be buried if half the mind lived on? And if Albert was gone, what now pulsed through the veins they once shared? The local physician at the time, a Dr. Morton Lee, documented the event. In his notes, he wrote, "There's no precedent. I have before me a living man whose brother is possibly dead, yet both inhabit the same flesh. This is no longer science. This is metaphysics. They chose not to declare Albert deceased. Albert remained conscious, but the left side of their body began to decay, muscles slackened, the left eye clouded, the lips cracked. The scent of putrefaction was undeniable, and still, Albert lived for 6 more days. Martha, then aged and weak herself, recorded only one more diary entry. He asked me to sew a sheet between them. I couldn't. I sewed the curtains instead. On the 7th day, Albert began seizing. The doctor could do nothing. He died later that night. And so ended the life or lives of the Bledsoe twins. Their bodies were buried together, of course. There was no other option. But the headstone reads only, Albert and Albert Bledsoe, 1834 to 1870. 2 minds, 1 mystery. Medical professionals debated the case for decades. It was cited in ethics lectures at Johns Hopkins and briefly revived during the conjoined twin separation debates of the early 20th century. But ultimately, the details were lost to time. The records were poorly preserved. Martha's diary vanished from public view after being inherited by a great-niece in Missouri. But one question continues to linger, and perhaps will always linger. Did one of them truly die before the other? Or had one simply gone silent while the other screamed into the void of a shared dying body? The burial was, by all accounts, uneventful. There were no reporters, no curious onlookers, no spectacle. Just a grave dug by a local farmhand and a casket built by a neighbor who had known the Bledsoes for 30 years. A pine box, hastily measured and awkwardly wide, was lowered into the clay-rich soil on the eastern side of the property, beneath a hickory tree that the twins had once watched birds from as children. The preacher, a cautious man who had once refused to baptize the boys separately, said a few vague words about God's mysteries and the indivisibility of divine purpose. No one knew what he meant. Perhaps he didn't either. Their mother, Martha, outlived them by only 4 months. In her final days, she reportedly stared often at the spot under the hickory tree and muttered the same line again, "I never knew which one I was tucking in at night." For nearly 20 years after the twins' death, medical journals sporadically revisited their case. The 1870 issue of the Western Kentucky Medical Review published a paper titled, "On the Death of One Mind in a Living Body, The Bledsoe Paradox." It proposed that Albert and Albert's alternating consciousness might be a form of duplex cerebral dominance, something akin to what we now call split brain phenomena, except in 2 literal brains. Later, as science advanced in medical ethics began to formalize, the Bledsoe twins reappeared in theoretical debates. In 1907, they were used as a case study in the first known American seminar on medical consent. Not because of what was known, but because of what wasn't. No one could say for certain how to handle 2 minds occupying one body when one mind refuses a procedure the other wants. That question, more than anything, haunted medical ethicists. Who is the patient? Who has rights? And perhaps more chilling, what happens to a body when half its mind dies? There were attempts later on to retroactively diagnose them using modern knowledge. In the 1970s, a researcher at the University of Louisville tried to map the Bledsoe anatomy from the scattered journals and notes that remained. But the records were incomplete. No autopsy had ever been performed. And Martha's diary, perhaps the most valuable personal document of the entire case, was still missing. To this day, no known photograph exists of Albert and Albert Bledsoe. No sketches, no daguerreotypes, no silhouettes. Just a grave marker and a few brittle pages scattered in university archives. In the modern telling of history, the Bledsoe twins often fall into the category of footnote, anecdote, or urban legend. Their story appears briefly in a few obscure 19th-century medical anthologies, and then nothing. They are not taught in schools. They do not appear in public memorials or museums. Even local history in Todd County has, over time, swept their existence under the porch. There are understandable reasons for this. The 19th century was not kind to those who defied classification, to be both one and two, both living and not, both independent and fused. Such people were neither celebrated nor studied with compassion. They were either hidden or exploited. That the Bledsoes were neither is, in its own quiet way, a miracle. They were not sold to circuses, nor paraded in public. They were not dissected, nor institutionalized. They were raised on a modest farm, educated to the best of their family's ability, and allowed to remain more or less at home. It wasn't a noble life, but it was a human one. A strange thing happened in 2011. A construction crew digging near the outskirts of Elkton, where the Bledsoe property once stood, uncovered what appeared to be an old stone marker buried deep and slanted sideways in the fairways in the fundu dirt. It bore a single engraving, now weathered and chipped. We were never just one thing. There is no record of who carved it. No mention of it in any registry or church document. It does not match the official grave marker on the family plot, but it has become something of a quiet local curiosity. Each year, a few students from Western Kentucky University make a field trip to visit it. Some leave flowers. Some leave coins. A few leave notes tucked in the soil, written in a split style, two halves of the same page, each side with its own voice. A tribute, perhaps, to a life that challenged every definition of identity, agency, and the limits of the body. And still, no one can answer the most lingering question of all. Were Albert and Albert one person, two people, or something else entirely? In a world increasingly obsessed with labeling everything by category, by biology, by role and function, the Bledsoe twins serve as a historical reminder of ambiguity, of edges that blur, of questions that outlive the people who ask them. Their story is not sensational. It is not filled with action or drama, but it is filled with one of the most quietly human struggles imaginable, the search to be known separately or together. Maybe they never wanted to be explained. Maybe they just wanted to be understood. When you think of the Great Fire of London in 1666, you probably imagine a chaotic scene, flames licking the sky, cobblestone streets filled with panicked citizens, and the entire skyline of timber-framed buildings collapsing into glowing ruin. And at the center of it all, there's one name that history keeps coming back to: Thomas Fariner, the baker on Pudding Lane. But what if I told you that Fariner probably didn't cause the fire? That despite 4 centuries of repetition, popular blame, and even a commemorative plaque marking his alleged shop, the evidence that he started the fire is more convenience than certainty? This is the story of a man quietly swallowed by history, not because he did anything particularly dramatic, but because he happened to be near something that was. And history, much like fire, tends to burn up nuance first. To understand what happened in the early hours of September 2, 1666, we first have to look at what London was like just before the fire. It was not, to be clear, a tidy city. By the mid-17th century, London was a cramped, foul-smelling maze of wooden buildings, narrow lanes, and open sewers. The streets were paved poorly and were often clogged with refuse, chamber pots emptied from second-story windows, and the general muck of 17th-century life. Fire was an everyday fear. Chimneys were rarely cleaned. Most homes were made of oak and filled with pitch, tar, and other flammable materials. Cooking was done over open flames, and candles were used for nearly everything. In short, the city was a matchbox waiting for a spark. It had already happened once. In 1633, a smaller fire destroyed 42 houses on London Bridge and a section of the bridge itself. But nothing had changed in its aftermath. There were regulations on paper, but they were mostly ignored. Builders continued to crowd streets with upper stories that jutted out and nearly touched across alleyways. Insurance didn't exist in a modern sense. Fire brigades were rudimentary bucket lines at best. So when the summer of 1666 turned out to be unusually dry after a long, hot season that left wood dry and brittle, the city was primed for disaster. Thomas Fariner was, by most records, a quiet, competent man. Born around 1615, he was a second-generation baker who had inherited his shop on Pudding Lane from his father. The shop was small, just 2 floors, 1 oven, and a family living space upstairs. He supplied bread to the Royal Navy and was not particularly wealthy, but well respected in the local baking guild. There was nothing especially remarkable about him. Until the night of September 1st, 1666. That night, Fariner, his daughter Hannah, and a servant went to bed around 10 p.m. A small fire was left burning in the oven downstairs, as was customary to keep the bakery warm for early morning bread making. Sometime just after midnight, smoke began to curl through the wooden floorboards. The exact sequence of what happened next is unclear. In his later testimony, Fariner claimed that the fire had spread too quickly to be controlled. He, his daughter, and the servant escaped by climbing out of an upper window into a neighbor's house. His maid, unfortunately, did not survive. She is recorded as the first official casualty of the Great Fire of London. But here's where the story takes a curious turn. For centuries, historians repeated the account. The fire started in Fariner's bakery. But the official investigation, at the time led by the Privy Council, was inconclusive. No forensic tools existed. No witnesses could definitively place the fire inside the oven. Fariner himself had motivation to deflect blame, and there were rumors, even then, of other possible sources. One theory pointed to a group of Dutch saboteurs. Given that England was at war with the Dutch Republic at the time, another accused French agents. One man, a mentally ill Frenchman named Robert Hubert, confessed to starting the fire by throwing a fireball into the bakery. He was later hanged, but most believed his confession was false. He hadn't even arrived in London until after the fire started. So why, then, was Fariner blamed? The simple answer is location. His house was the first confirmed structure seen burning. That was enough for the city, enough for history, and enough to let the deeper issues, poor urban planning, combustible infrastructure, and administrative neglect, go up in smoke without consequence. It's easier to blame a baker than a bureaucracy. In the days following the fire, Fariner wasn't arrested. He wasn't punished. In fact, he returned to baking shortly after the event. He even signed a petition to Parliament later that year, supporting the idea that the fire had been started by foreign saboteurs, likely to redirect attention from his own doorstep. His life continued more or less as it had before, though the city around him had changed dramatically. 80% of London's old city burned in the fire. Over 13,000 houses were destroyed, along with 87 churches and the old St. Paul's Cathedral. It took 4 days to extinguish the flames, by pulling down buildings to create fire breaks, and by then, much of central London had been reduced to ash. And yet, the official death toll was strangely low, only 6 recorded deaths. Historians now believe the number was likely much higher, but records were poorly kept, and the poor often went uncounted. Fariner lived through it. So did his daughter and servant. And in 1670, when the new monument to the Great Fire of London was built near Pudding Lane, it included a plaque that explicitly blamed the treachery and malice of the Popish faction. The Catholic-Protestant tension of the time had found its scapegoat. Eventually, even that line was removed. But Fariner's name remained attached to the fire, almost out of habit. It's worth noting something else. The fire, while devastating, ultimately saved London from something worse. Just the year before, in 1665, London had suffered the last major outbreak of the bubonic plague. It had killed over 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population. Rats and fleas thrived in the filth and overcrowded homes of the medieval street plan, but the fire cleared it all out. The slums were gone, the pests were reduced. Sanitation, while still crude, improved in the rebuilding. In other words, the fire that Fariner was blamed for may have prevented further outbreaks of plague. It forced the city to modernize, slowly and painfully. Streets were widened. Building codes were introduced, though not always followed. Fire insurance became a real industry. And Christopher Wren's architectural visions reshaped the skyline. None of this was Thomas Fariner's doing. And yet all of it is linked to him. Fariner died in 1670, just 4 years after the fire. His bakery was rebuilt. His descendants continued to work as bakers in East London for at least another generation. His name faded into mild notoriety, and the plaque on Pudding Lane became his legacy. But what if it wasn't true? What if the fire started next door? What if it was caused by a smoldering candle, or an errant coal from a neighbor's stove, or a lightning strike that no one saw? What if Thomas Fariner was simply a man asleep who woke up into history? Thomas Fariner did not live long enough to see how thoroughly history would brand him. He died just 4 years after the Great Fire of London, but his name had already become shorthand for catastrophe. The irony is that while the fire reshaped the city, it also reshaped the narrative, and it wasn't long before the subtleties of truth gave way to simpler storytelling. One man, one bakery, one spark. It's a neat origin myth. But history is rarely so clean. Let's take a slow walk through how London, and the people in it, began to write and then rewrite the story of one of its greatest disasters, choosing the convenience of a single villain over the messines of systemic failure. The Great Fire began in the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666. By Monday night, it had reached Ludgate Hill. By Tuesday, the old St. Paul's Cathedral had collapsed in flames. And by Wednesday, the wind had finally died down enough for fire breaks to slow its spread. In 4 days, over 13,000 homes were gone. That left nearly 100,000 people homeless, more than a fifth of the city's population. And yet, few deaths were officially recorded. Most accounts cite 6 or 7. Historians now believe many more perished, their remains consumed or lost in the rubble of collapsing buildings, uncounted because they were poor, foreign, or simply unseen. But in the aftermath, London needed answers. People wanted someone to blame, not something. Not dry wood, poor planning, or 17th century infrastructure. No, they wanted a person. And Thomas Fariner, asleep above his bakery on Pudding Lane, was an easy target, not because there was proof, but because he was first. On September 6th, just 4 days after the fire began, a man named Robert Hubert was arrested. Hubert was a French watchmaker, or possibly a clockmaker, or possibly not a watchmaker at all. Records vary. What is clear is that he was not mentally well. He had arrived in England shortly before the fire, and under questioning, he confessed to setting the fire intentionally by throwing a fireball into Fariner's bakery through a window. It sounded dramatic. It sounded plausible. It was also impossible. Hubert hadn't even arrived in London until September 3rd, after the fire had started. His confession changed several times. At one point, he said he acted alone. Then he named accomplices. Then he changed the location entirely. Then he claimed to be part of a wider French plot. Despite obvious contradictions, the authorities leaned into his confession. Hubert was a foreigner. England was at war with France and the Dutch Republic. Nationalist rage was high, and the idea of foreign sabotage was more satisfying than blaming a baker, or worse, the city itself. Hubert was tried and found guilty. He was hanged at Tyburn on October 27, 1666, and even as the rope tightened around his neck, Fariner was still alive and baking. After the fire, Fariner never publicly admitted guilt. He offered no apology. In fact, he positioned himself as another victim of the fire, not its cause. In 1667, he co-signed a petition to Parliament that declared the fire to be the work of Papists, a derogatory term for Catholics, who had long been scapegoated in Protestant England for everything from plague to political intrigue. This was no isolated claim. Anti-Catholic sentiment had been growing for decades, and the fire gave it fresh fuel. In that climate, Fariner's story faded into the background. He became less a suspect and more a narrative fixture there, but not examined too closely. It helped that the King Charles II was eager to rebuild and move on. Blame was useful, but only if it didn't hinder progress, and Fariner's bakery, though destroyed, was rebuilt quietly, without ceremony. He resumed baking. He died in 1670. The city, meanwhile, continued to rebuild. In 1677, a 202-foot column designed by Sir Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke was erected near the site of Fariner's bakery. Simply called the Monument, it still stands today. It commemorates the Great Fire. But its original inscription, engraved in Latin, told a more accusatory tale. It read, in part, "Here by the permission of heaven, hell broke loose upon this Protestant city from the burning of this popish house." That line would remain until 1681, when tensions with Catholics reached a peak during the so-called popish plot hysteria. The inscription was then revised to blame the Catholic faction directly, stating, "The most dreadful burning of this city, begun and carried on by the treachery and malice of the popish faction." And that version would stay in place for over 150 years. It wasn't until 1830, under mounting pressure from reformers, that the anti-Catholic line was chiseled off. Fariner's name was never mentioned on the monument. But by then, the connection was firmly entrenched. The fire started in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane. And who was the baker? Thomas Farr Reiner. No further questions asked. Curiously, despite his centrality to the event, there are almost no personal records from Fariner himself, no surviving letters, no detailed journals, no legal documents explaining his side. What we have comes from court testimony, parish records, and guild rolls. In other words, we know him as a data point, not a person. What little we know of his daughter Hannah comes from the same sources. She escaped the fire with her father, later married into a baker's family, and disappeared from the record. The servant girl, whose name was likely Mary, became the first official victim, but nothing else is known. Not her age, not her family, not even her grave. In that silence, stories grew. Stories like, Fariner fell asleep with the oven still burning. Or, the coals were old and didn't seem hot. Or, his chimney had never been cleaned. Or, he ignored safety rules. There's no evidence for any of these claims. But when you live in the shadow of disaster, details become suggestions, and suggestions become fact. The truth is likely far more mundane and damning in its own way. The fire was not caused by one man. It was caused by a city that refused to listen. For decades, London had ignored warnings about fire safety. There were royal proclamations demanding that houses be built of brick and stone, not timber. These were widely ignored. There were fines for block streets and overhanging second floors. Rarely enforced. No one thought it would matter. And then, in 4 days, it mattered. If Thomas Fariner hadn't existed, the fire would have found someone else. A dropped candle, a chimney ember, a hot pan left unattended. The city was built to burn. Today, if you visit Pudding Lane, you'll find a modest plaque that reads, "Here in Pudding Lane, on the 2nd of September 1666, started the Great Fire of London." It does not name Thomas Fariner, but it doesn't have to. We've already written him into the story. And it's a quiet reminder that the people we blame often have the least control. Fariner didn't build London's narrow streets. He didn't write the fire codes. He didn't cause the wind to blow for 4 days straight. He didn't stop the fire brigades from arriving too late. He simply lived where the match dropped. The fire had finished its work in just 4 days. But the rebuilding of London, physically, socially, and historically, took decades. And at the center of that rebuilding stood a man who had already vanished into the ashes. Thomas Fariner. His name never appeared on the monument. No street was named after him. He wasn't honored, punished, or even remembered in any formal way. He simply slipped into the seams of history, reduced to a vague identity, the baker. But the fire he was blamed for would ignite sweeping change across the entire city. So let's look at what came next, not just in the architecture or fire codes, but in the quieter corners where memory, rumor, and record-keeping collide. Because this is where Fariner's legacy, such as it is, was truly written. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Fire, most Londoners expected the city to be rebuilt just as it had been, quickly and cheaply. But the scale of the destruction made that impossible. Over 400 acres of London were reduced to charred rubble. The River Thames, which had once been a vital transport artery, now ran past scorched banks and makeshift camps of the displaced. Tent cities rose on the fields outside the city walls. While Parliament debated how to prevent this from happening again, King Charles II, perhaps sensing an opportunity to remake the city in a grander style, commissioned new plans from some of the era's best thinkers, including Christopher Wren. Wren proposed a rational grid-like layout with wide boulevards and uniform brick houses. Others suggested plazas, parks, and colonnades to reflect European ideals of city planning. None of it happened. Property owners were impatient. Merchants wanted their stalls back. Landowners insisted on keeping their oddly shaped medieval plots. And in the end, the city was rebuilt almost exactly where it stood before, though now, with a few practical changes. New building codes mandated stone and brick instead of timber. Streets were made slightly wider. Regulations for chimneys, roofing, and storage of combustible materials were enforced, at least for a while. Fire insurance was born, with companies establishing their own private fire brigades to protect insured clients. But these changes were uneven, and they weren't Fariner's doing. Still, they were because of the fire that began in or near his shop. He became the quiet ghost at the edge of reform. It's easy to assume that blame fades with time. But in Fariner's case, it did the opposite. As the decades passed, his name reappeared in ballads, pamphlets, and eventually, history textbooks. A 1720 children's primer called A True and Frightful Tale of London's Flames includes the line, "In Pudding Lane, a careless flame by baker's hand set all aflame." It rhymed, it fit the meter. And that was enough. Over time, his role became canon. No trial, no conviction, no evidence, just location. Just timing. By the 19th century, schoolbooks named him without hesitation. Tour guides in London still point to Pudding Lane and explain, almost casually, this is where the fire started. A baker's oven. His name was Thomas Fariner. That's how stories stick, not with truth, but with repetition. Of course, the city moved on. By the early 1700s, London was booming again. Its population grew, trade flourished, and its architecture became a mix of the old medieval logic and newer Georgian symmetry. Wren rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral, now in stone, with a dome that would become iconic. But what happened to the quiet people? To Fariner's family? To the hundreds of small tradesmen and women whose lives were overturned, rebuilt, or quietly ended? Most were never recorded. Fariner's daughter Hannah lived into adulthood, married, and likely continued the family business for some time. But no record of her death exists, no known portrait. Just a mention here and there in church logs and business ledgers. Servant girl who died, probably named Mary, was buried without a headstone. Even the homes destroyed were mostly forgotten within a generation. Only the largest structures, the churches, guild halls, and civic buildings, were built in visible form. The rest were paved over, written out, or remembered only as statistics. 13,200 homes, 87 parish churches, 44 company halls, 1 cathedral, and 1 bakery. But what does a bakery mean when history decides it was the source of all that followed? Here's where the story bends just a little, because while Fariner was blamed informally, historically and symbolically, his legacy is not entirely one of shame. The Worshipful Company of Bakers, London's official bakers' guild, never removed his name. He remained on their records. His descendants continued to work in the trade, and more curiously, as modern historians revisited the fire, many began to question the official story. Some pointed out that the wind patterns on that night would have carried the fire west, even if it started several buildings down from Fariner's shop. Others noted that fire watches had reported multiple points of origin, which would be consistent with an accidental spark from coal fires or scattered embers during a dry summer. A few suggested that the fire may have already been burning in the timbers of nearby homes, and Fariner's bakery was just the first place it visibly broke through. In other words, he may have been asleep when the fire began, but it might not have begun with him. Why does this matter? Because history is often about simplification. It's easier to say, a careless baker burned London, than it is to say, a complex web of negligence, poor planning, dry weather, and wooden architecture combined with human error to destroy a city. We crave a story, one man, one spark, one fall, but what happens to the people caught inside that story? The ones who lived quietly, did their jobs, and happened to be too close when history struck? That's the thread that runs through the life and legacy of Thomas Fariner. He didn't write pamphlets. He didn't defend himself in Parliament. He didn't carve his own name into stone, but 4 centuries later, we still say it. The Great Fire of London started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, and every time we say it, we whisper Fariner's name, whether we mean to or not. Perhaps the most human stories in history are not the grand battles or the royal scandals, but the quiet tragedies of misplaced blame. The people who get remembered not for what they did, but for where they were standing when something bigger happened. Fariner may have made the bread that fed part of London, but history decided that his oven fed the fire, and the truth, as always, is harder to prove, especially when it smells like burnt bread and centuries-old fear. In the early autumn of 1845, something invisible settled on the Irish countryside. It came not with the thunder of war or the rage of revolution, but on a damp wind. It arrived quietly, slipping through the hedgerows and rolling across green fields heavy with promise. At first, no one noticed. The potato plants still stood tall in late September, their leaves broad, their stalks thick. But by the end of the month, something was wrong. The leaves blackened, the stalks collapsed. And when farmers dug into the soil, they found the tubers rotting, soft and stinking of sour decay. No one knew it yet, but Ireland had entered the first year of what would become the Great Famine, a slow grinding disaster that would last nearly a decade, kill over 1 million people, and drive another 2 million to leave the country entirely. And at the heart of it was the potato, a food so humble, so unassuming, that few understood how deeply the nation's survival depended on it, until it was gone. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the relationship between Ireland and the potato in 1845. The potato was not native to Ireland. It had arrived in Europe from South America in the late 1500s, and over time it had become a staple crop across much of the continent. But in Ireland, it became something more, the backbone of the rural diet. Especially among the poor. For the majority of Irish peasants who lived on tiny plots of rented land, often subdivided through generations, the potato offered a rare miracle. It grew easily in poor soil. It needed little space, and it was calorically dense. A family of 6 could, in theory, survive on a single acre of well-managed potato cultivation. By 1845, this wasn't just theory. It was practice. The average Irish laborer and his family ate up to 10 pounds of potatoes a day, boiled, mashed, cold, warm, every day of the year. It was a simple, monotonous diet, but it worked. With some milk, maybe some herring or oats if luck allowed, the people of rural Ireland managed a subsistence lifestyle. But it was a fragile system. Behind the illusion of stability was a precarious foundation. One crop, one strain, one blight away from collapse. The cause of the blight was a microscopic organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that traveled in spores, invisible to the eye but deadly to the potato plant. It likely arrived from North America on ships carrying infected potatoes. The weather in Ireland during the summer of 1845, cool, wet, and cloudy, created the perfect conditions for the blight to thrive. It started in the south, in County Waterford and parts of Wexford. Farmers reported the leaves of the plants turning black almost overnight. By early October, the rot had spread to the underground tubers. By November, it was everywhere. Within weeks, entire harvests were lost. But this was only the beginning. In 1845, many still believed it was a one-off. Crops failed all the time. The government, such as it was, issued statements encouraging people not to panic. Officials in London referred to the blight as a temporary setback. The newspapers reported on it, but with more curiosity than alarm. The real hunger hadn't yet begun. That would come in the winter. At the time, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, ruled from London. But its treatment by the British government was often colonial in nature, economic, paternalistic, and distant. The Irish population was overwhelmingly Catholic, poor, and rural. The landlords, in contrast, were often Protestant and absentee. Living in England while their estates were managed by local agents, this social structure was brittle at best. The British elite viewed the Irish as lazy, backwards, and morally suspect assumptions that would shape every policy decision in the years to come. When the first reports of the blight reached Whitehall in the autumn of 1845, they were met with measured interest. The British Prime Minister at the time, Sir Robert Peel, took the news seriously. He commissioned scientific investigations. He began purchasing Indian corn, maize from America, to store as emergency food. Quietly, without fanfare, he repealed the Corn Laws, a deeply controversial set of tariffs that had kept bread artificially expensive. Peel's actions were limited by political constraints and public opinion. Many in Parliament believed that too much aid would make the Irish dependent. They argued that charity would ruin the work ethic. They insisted that free market forces, not government intervention, should determine the outcome. And so, as the potatoes rotted and hunger crept into the cottages of Western Ireland, London watched and waited. In the winter of 1845–46, the Irish peasantry endured a quiet, gnawing horror. Those who had saved potatoes from the previous year rationed them carefully. Others turned to oats if they could afford them. Some survived by boiling nettles, wild greens, or thin soup made from bones. There are scattered accounts, mostly from traveling clergy, of families boiling stones, not to eat them, of course, but to give children the illusion of a meal in the hope they'd fall asleep. Others starved. And all the while, in the harbors, ships filled with grain left Ireland daily, bound for England. Corn, oats, barley, beef, butter, all exported. Because Ireland, paradoxically, still produced food. But that food was owned by landlords. And the landlords were still being paid. If tenants could not pay rent, they were evicted. In the early months of 1846, thousands of families were turned out of their homes. Some ended up in makeshift shelters, some died in ditches. Some boarded ships bound for Canada or America, coffin ships, as they came to be known, where disease often killed more than hunger. Yet still, the government hesitated. By the spring of 1846, Peel was gone. He had been ousted by political rivals who disapproved of his repeal of the Corn Laws. His replacement, Lord John Russell, took a harsher view. Russell's government embraced a policy of laissez-faire economics, the belief that the market would correct itself without interference. Under this view, the famine was seen not as a humanitarian disaster, but as a natural adjustment. Prices would rise, demand would fall, land would be consolidated. The strong would survive. This philosophy bled into policy. Soup kitchens were established, but often underfunded and inconsistent. Public works programs were created, requiring starving men to break rocks or build roads in exchange for a few pence a day work that left them too exhausted to find food. Grain depots sold corn at cost, but it had to be ground into flour, and most Irish peasants had neither the money nor the mills. Worst of all, in many areas, relief was denied to anyone who owned more than a quarter acre of land. A rule designed to prevent fraud. It instead punished those trying to hang on to subsistence farming. And so, as the spring of 1846 passed, the blight returned. The potato crop that year failed again. And now, there was no food left. This wasn't a famine of sudden collapse. It was a bureaucratic famine, one allowed to happen because policy demanded efficiency, because relief was viewed as charity, and because the Irish were seen as morally suspect. Thomas Carlyle, a British essayist of the time, wrote, "Ireland is like a half-starved rat that crosses your path. It is not a human entity." This wasn't a fringe view. It was the polite consensus. And so, millions of Irish men, women, and children faced starvation not because food didn't exist, but because the system had decided they didn't matter enough to feed. By the end of 1846, with the second failed harvest, the rural Irish had stopped asking if the famine would end. They now asked something else, quieter and more terrifying. If the potato is gone, what are we? Because the potato wasn't just a crop. It was their livelihood, their diet, their schedule, their land strategy, their dowries and marriages and births. It was, quite literally, the root of the culture. And now it had turned to mush in the ground. And as 1847 approached, a year that would come to be known as Black 47, the Irish faced a choice with no good answers: stay and starve, leave and risk dying at sea, or wait for help that might never come. By January of 1847, the land was already starving. The potato crop had failed a second year. The fields were empty. The air was wet and cold, and the villages of Western Ireland had taken on an unnatural stillness. Local priests began reporting that the bells no longer rang for funerals, not because there were no dead, but because there were too many. Every day, wagons creaked through parishes collecting bodies. Sometimes they were buried in shared graves. Sometimes they were left by crossroads or in ditches. In some regions, the dead were placed in abandoned churches, lined shoulder to shoulder against the walls. But even death, it seemed, could be delayed by bureaucracy. This was the year the famine became inescapable. The Irish would call it Blaen an Air, the year of the slaughter. We now call it Black 47. By 1847, over 500,000 people were enrolled in public works programs meant to provide income and prevent outright starvation. But these schemes, administered from London, were riddled with inefficiency and cold ideology. Work was assigned with no regard for local conditions. Roads were ordered to be built to nowhere, literally. In some counties, men were paid pennies to break rocks on hillsides that led nowhere, for projects with no purpose beyond the idea that they should earn their relief. One official wrote that the poor must be made to learn the value of labor, as if famine had anything to do with laziness. Even children were expected to contribute. In County Mayo, girls of 10 and boys of 12 were issued small picks and sent to flatten terrain. they collapsed in fields. They fell asleep beside wheelbarrows. They disappeared from the rolls. And then there was the food itself. Maize, Indian corn, was still being imported from America. But it was unfamiliar to many Irish people, difficult to digest, and lacked key nutrients. Without milk, it could cause serious intestinal distress, particularly in children. They called it Peel's brimstone, a bitter yellow meal that came too late, in sacks carried by bureaucrats. The last stop for many starving families was the workhouse, a relic of England's poor law system. The workhouse was designed not to provide care, but to discourage entry. Conditions were intentionally harsh. Families were separated by gender. Meals were minimal. Clothing was assigned. Privacy was abolished. During the famine, these institutions were overwhelmed. Rooms built for 200 held 800. Disease ran rampant: typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever. The very buildings became contagion zones, and still people came. Because there was nowhere else to go. In Skibbereen, County Cork, one of the famine's most devastated towns, the workhouse filled beyond bursting. The local cemetery, Abbeystrury, was soon packed with mass graves. The dead were buried in shallow trenches, 30 and 40 at a time. Today, Skibbereen has a famine museum. But in 1847, it was an open wound on the edge of the empire, those who could scrape together enough for passage out. But escape was often another form of slow suffering. Emigration had always been part of Irish life, but during the famine, it became an exodus. Families sold what little they had: livestock, land, even burial plots, to pay for passage to America, Canada, or Australia. The cheapest ships were often repurposed cargo vessels, poorly ventilated, uninspected, and overcrowded. On these, mortality rates sometimes reached 30%. Diseases like cholera and typhus spread rapidly in the confined spaces. Clean water was scarce. Sanitation was non-existent. They came to be known as coffin ships. In 1847 alone, an estimated 250,000 people left Ireland. For every ship that reached port, there were tales of those that arrived with more corpses than passengers, and even survivors weren't always welcomed. In Grosse Isle, Quebec, a quarantine station set up by Canadian authorities, over 5,000 Irish immigrants died in temporary shelters in 1 year. Their bodies were buried in long rectangular trenches, sometimes without markers. Many didn't even make it that far. Parents buried children at sea. Wives were widowed between Cork and New York. In the halls of Parliament, the famine had become politicized. Newspapers framed it as a tragedy, but a manageable one. Some British papers suggested that famine was cleansing the Irish population, breaking an outdated land system and clearing the way for modernization. Politicians in Russell's government debated the moral hazards of over-subsidizing relief. The doctrine of laissez-faire still dominated. The belief that free markets would regulate food supply meant that grain continued to be exported, even from counties where people were starving. A member of Parliament famously remarked, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson." That man was Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury and the official in charge of famine relief. His name is still remembered in Ireland. Even at the peak of the famine, Ireland remained a net exporter of food. In 1847 alone, while people died in the mud outside abandoned cottages, Ireland exported 4,000 shiploads of oats, 30 of barley, over 200,000 sheep, tens of thousands of cattle, all bound for England. This wasn't an oversight. It was policy. Landlords, many of whom lived across the Irish Sea, demanded their rents. If tenants couldn't pay, their land was seized and used for pasture. Cattle and grain fetched more on the British market than tenant farmers ever would. And so the food left, and the people remained and died. Across rural Ireland, entire villages disappeared. In County Clare, A census taker in 1851 wrote that he found no one living where 40 families had stood 5 years before. In Connemara, old women were found sitting beside the bones of relatives. In Donegal, thatched roofs caved in on empty hearths. Nature began reclaiming what had once been dense human settlement. Birds nested in crumbled chimneys. Ivy crept over cottage walls. Children's shoes were left where they'd been set down last. In some areas, the Irish language itself began to recede. Entire communities of native speakers had died or emigrated. The trauma left a silence deeper than words. This was not a war. There were no armies, no sieges, no battlefields. It was something harder to define. A convergence of plant disease, land, policy, imperial neglect, and social cruelty. No one held a sword, but people died all the same, by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the million. And unlike other disasters, this one came with no villain to overthrow. Just a system too rigid to respond, a government too ideological to act, and an empire that had learned to mistake its own success for justice. By the end of 1847, 1 million Irish were gone, dead, exiled, or missing. And still, the blight came back. By 1852, the famine had, in official terms, ended. The blight itself still lingered, appearing in some regions again in 1848, 1849, and as late as 1851, but by then, there was little left to destroy. The Irish countryside had already been hollowed out. More than 1 million people were dead. Another 2 million had fled, most never to return. Entire parishes had disappeared. Fields once filled with rows of potato mounds now lay fallow, scattered, with crumbling stone walls and roofless cottages. Census takers in 1851 found entire counties with populations cut in half. The land had survived, but the people had not. In many parts of Western Ireland, particularly in Connaught, Clare, and Kerry, what remained resembled not so much a society as a patchwork of ghosts. The land was strangely quiet. The old songs were fading. Irish language speakers dwindled in number. Before the famine, Irish Gaelic had been the dominant tongue west of the Shannon. By 1900, it was classified as endangered. Famine didn't just kill people. It killed traditions. It killed continuity. Storytelling, once passed down from generation to generation by the fire, became fragmented. Music turned mournful. Dance slowed. The laughter of children, once abundant, even among the poor, grew sparse. In some villages, the only full registers were in the church cemeteries. The Irish diaspora was never truly voluntary. By the 1860s, Irish communities had taken root in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Montreal, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Sydney. Most arrived penniless. Many spoke only Irish. Some had never seen a paved street or entered a school. In these cities, they were often met with suspicion, hostility, or outright violence. In New York, signs appeared in shop windows, "No Irish need apply." In London, Irish immigrants were scapegoated for crime, disease, and political unrest. In Canada, Irish laborers died building canals and railways in horrific conditions, their names forgotten. But they built, nonetheless, and over time, the diaspora hardened into resilience. Churches, schools, labor unions, newspapers, all were founded to protect and uplift the Irish abroad. St. Patrick's Day, once a quiet religious observance in Ireland, became a parade of identity in American cities. What had been lost in one country slowly took root in another. But the cost was steep. An entire generation of Irish never saw their homeland again. One of the most unsettling legacies of the famine was how it reshaped land ownership in Ireland. Before the famine, Ireland's rural landscape was carved into tiny plots, worked by tenant farmers who paid rent to absentee landlords. Families subdivided land among sons, leading to ever smaller holdings that could barely support a household. After the famine, that changed. Evictions, either forced or economically inevitable, cleared the land. Those who remained often consolidated farms. The result, a new, wealthier class of tenants emerged, while the poorest had died or emigrated. In some circles, this was seen as progress. One British report from 1852 noted approvingly, "Ireland is now rid of her surplus population." There was little pretense by then. This had been an opportunity, and it had been used. By the early 1850s, the British government considered the Irish problem solved, at least economically. The land had been cleared. Market forces had done their work. Agriculture shifted from subsistence crops to grazing, dairy, and export goods. In Parliament, there were no commemorations, no inquiries, no public apologies. Ireland had endured a catastrophe, but Britain had survived it. The political establishment moved on. And for a long time, so did official history. There was no war, no treaty, no memorial for the famine dead. Not in Dublin, not in London. For decades, the famine remained a whispered wound in Irish households. The trauma ran so deep that many survivors refused to speak of it. Children asked questions and were told nothing. Family lines broke without explanation. What remains today is often incomplete. Parish records with sudden gaps. Census pages where entire families vanished between 1845 and 1851. Mass graves, unmarked or overgrown. Letters from abroad describing families who never received them. Even the few photographs that survive from the 1850s show a country stunned into silence. The famine changed Ireland permanently. But its ripples went far beyond that island. It redefined the Irish identity abroad. Fusing tragedy with resilience. It ignited movements for Irish independence. As a younger generation of exiles came to see British rule as not just distant, but lethal. It shaped attitudes toward immigration in receiving countries, as Irish enclaves became part of urban landscapes in North America and beyond, and it forged a cultural memory that was carried like a quiet grief, passed down through families, layered beneath humor and music and poetry. Today, many of the world's estimated 70 million people of Irish descent trace their roots to the famine years. For some, it's a genealogical curiosity. For others, a defining family story. But in Ireland itself, it's something harder to name. Visit rural Ireland today, and you'll still see the ruins, roofless stone cottages, moss-covered walls, and narrow roads that curve through fields once lined with potato drills. In places like Doolau, Gordadrislig, and Skibbereen, memorials now mark sites of famine roads, mass graves, and walkways taken by the starving. They are simple: a stone cross, a rusted plaque, a tree planted in silence. They don't shout, they whisper. And maybe that's fitting, because the famine wasn't a disaster of fire or thunder. It was a disaster of waiting, of people watching their food rot, watching their families disappear, watching ships sail away with wheat they had grown but could not eat. What happened in Ireland between 1845 and 1852 wasn't just a famine. It was a slow betrayal, a lesson in how systems fail, not by malice alone, but by inertia, by the belief that theory matters more than people, by the cold logic of empire and the silent power of distance. The blight came from nature, but the famine came from policy, and the hunger, like the memory, was passed down not through official history books, but through the absences that followed: empty fields, empty villages, empty chairs at dinner tables. And still, it shaped the world. In 18th century France, the hour depended on where you stood. Noon came when the sun was at its highest in your town, not in Paris, not at Versailles, but on your street, above your church steeple, shadowing your own village square. Each town had its own rhythm, its own bells, its own unwritten agreements about how the day should unfold. There were clocks, of course, cathedral clocks, tower clocks, personal timepieces, but these were as much statements of status as tools for coordination. A train couldn't be late because trains didn't exist. A worker might rise with the sun and eat when the bell rang, but even that bell was set by someone in town. Not by decree from above. Into this world was born Jean-Baptiste Fargues, a modest clockmaker from the southern town of Montauban, near Toulouse. He was not a revolutionary, nor a scientist, nor a man of influence. But he had an idea, quiet, methodical, and strangely radical. Fargues was born in 1712, the son of a weaver and a washerwoman. By his mid-teens, he had apprenticed under a local horloger, a watchmaker, who taught him the intricacies of pendulums, escapements, and mainsprings. He was not especially ambitious, but he was meticulous. By the 1740s, Fargues had developed a reputation across the Occitan region for building extraordinarily accurate long-case clocks, what you and I would call grandfather clocks. Wealthy families from Toulouse would send riders to request his services. He carved cases by hand. He cast gears in small batches. His signature was not flashy, but rather a perfectly balanced second hand, gliding in smooth rhythm, and it was rhythm, more than time itself, that fascinated him. He once wrote in a letter to a friend, "Time is not a number, it is a pattern, a pulse. And if we could hear the nation as a machine, we might discover that it ticks out of sync." In 1751, France was in flux. King Louis XV reigned in Versailles. Paris was crowded and dirty, but intellectually alive. The salons buzzed with philosophy. The encyclopedists, led by Delarnde and d'Alembert, were assembling a compendium of all human knowledge. Science, mechanics, and reason were fashionable pursuits. And in this climate, a small but important project was underway: the standardization of units. The French Academy of Sciences had begun debating the need for common weights and measures. 1 foot in Paris was not necessarily the same as a foot in Lyon. 1 pound in Bordeaux differed from a pound in Lille. Trade, taxation, and manufacturing were hindered by this local inconsistency. Into this conversation, Fargues inserted a letter. It was short, polite, and curious. He proposed that, just as France needed a standard meter and a standard kilogram, it also needed a standard hour, 1 time, measured precisely and distributed across the kingdom. No one responded. Not officially, but someone noticed. In 1752, Fargues received a summons not from the Academy, but from the Bureau du Roi, the King's administrative office for mechanical instruments. They were interested in his proposal, not because of its philosophical merit, but because of its logistical implications. The King's inspectors were increasingly frustrated by missed deliveries, misaligned timetables, and even military drills that failed to synchronize across regions. What Fargues proposed might help. He was invited to Paris for 3 weeks to present his methods. He packed a single trunk and took one of his smallest clocks, just over 4 feet tall, fitted with a pendulum he had calibrated to his own heartbeat. In the salons of Paris, he was a curiosity, a provincial with dirty shoes and an obsession with second hands. He was mocked briefly by the mathematician Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, who found his approach charming but amateurish. Voltaire, in a letter, referred to him as le poète des horloges, the poet of clocks, but someone higher up saw value. Fargues was asked to construct 3 identical clocks, to be placed in Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux. If they could be synchronized, the plan was to issue a decree encouraging towns to match their public clocks to one of these national regulators. It wasn't quite official policy, but it was an experiment, and Fargues took it very seriously. In 1754, Fargues delivered the clocks. They were works of quiet precision, each housed in a dark walnut case, fitted with brass weights and a dual escapement to reduce drift. The pendulums were made of a rare iron alloy to resist temperature changes. On the hour, they struck a tone calibrated to match the bell at Notre Dame. The clocks were installed, wound, and set. And for 6 days, they kept perfect time. But then, came the problem no mechanism could fix: weather, humidity in Bordeaux, a cold snap in Lyon, variations in temperature, barometric pressure, and altitude all affected the speed of the pendulums, however slightly. By the second week, the clocks were off by minutes. Local officials sent complaints. Towns that had tried to adjust their schedules to match found themselves more confused than before, and worse, without any kind of time distribution system, no telegraph, no coordinated network, it was impossible to reset all three clocks simultaneously. Synchronization drifted. Disagreements flared. The idea was deemed interesting but impractical. The project was shelved. Fargues returned to Montauban with no fanfare. Though the experiment had failed, it left a mark, if not on the state, then in the minds of certain thinkers. The idea of synchronized national time would not die. Years later, as France moved toward revolution and eventually into Napoleon's empire, standardization became an obsession. The metric system was adopted. Calendars were reformed. Decimal time was proposed briefly. But it was in the 19th century, with the rise of the railroad, that Fargues's dream returned in full force. Trains needed timetables, and timetables required a single time. Eventually, France, like many nations, created a national time standard. Clocks were coordinated to Paris Mean Time, and later to Greenwich. Fargues never lived to see it. He died in 1781, quietly in the same town where he was born. His estate contained 6 clocks, 3 unfinished. One of them had no numbers, just a pendulum ticking endlessly under a glass dome. His papers were sold, misplaced, and forgotten. Only one phrase remains in a notebook. Found decades later: time is not what it seems. It does not belong to kings. It belongs to rhythm. When Fargues returned to Montauban in 1754, it was with the quiet dignity of someone who had tried to do something enormous and had failed. But his failure wasn't dramatic. No one had mocked him in the newspapers. No public humiliation awaited. There had simply been no appetite, no infrastructure, no urgency for the idea of national time. The clocks had worked, in a technical sense. But in 18th century France, there was no system capable of distributing time evenly across hundreds of towns and cities. Synchronization without communication was like music without a conductor. So the Bureau du ROI thanked him politely, filed the report away, and resumed managing the instruments of court and commerce as before. But something had shifted in Fargues. He no longer believed the problem was mechanical. He believed it was philosophical. To understand why Fargues became quietly radical in his later years, we need to revisit how people understood time in his world. In 1750s France, time was still largely experiential. People measured their days by bells, shadows, and rituals, not numbers. A peasant might wake with the rooster, eat when the sun was 2 hands above the trees, and end the day when it dipped below the hills. In towns, church bells gave structure. In cities, watchmen shouted the hour at night from street corners. Even among the educated, time was not fixed. It changed slightly from town to town, day to day, depending on the sun and the season. The concept of true time existed, but it wasn't relevant to most people's lives. Fargues, however, had begun to imagine something new, not just clocks, but time itself as a shared agreement, a social contract, much like law or language. In this vision, clocks were not just tools. They were mediators of consensus. In the last years of his life, Fargues began writing. It wasn't a treatise in the style of Diderot. It wasn't scientific. It was more like a meditation, part diary, part technical notes, part speculative essay. He titled it Le Temps pour tous, Time for All. Only fragments survive today, mostly preserved by later horologists who found his ideas curious but impractical. Still, what remains is revealing. In one passage, Fargues wrote, "A child in Lion and a priest in breast should strike their bells at the same moment, not because of obligation, but because they belong to the same rhythm. Elsewhere, when each town keeps its own hour, there's no nation, only neighbors with mismatched shadows. And most striking of all, one day time will be sent down wires. It will arrive like a letter. All clocks will listen. He didn't know how, of course. He didn't foresee the telegraph or the railway. But he understood that synchronization required communication. And he intuited that time in the future would no longer be merely kept. It would be distributed, but not everyone shared Fargus's vision. Even among fellow craftsmen, his ideas were met with polite skepticism. Clockmakers in nearby Toulouse and Bordeaux dismissed the idea of national time as Parisian logic, a form of centralization that would flatten local culture. One wrote in a letter, "Let Parisians dine at noon. In Gascony, we eat when the soup is ready." The regionalism wasn't just stubbornness. It was identity. To impose the same hour on every town felt like erasing their uniqueness. What Fargus saw as unity, others saw as conformity. Even the church had reservations. Bells were rung not just to mark time, but to sanctify it, to remind people that hours belonged to God. Replacing that with mechanical standardization felt, to some, like a kind of heresy. So while Fargus tinkered in his shop, building clocks that agreed with each other down to the second, most of France continued as it had for centuries, with village time, bell time, market time, church time, and Paris time, all coexisting in their quiet disorder. Fargus died in 1781, just before the storm clouds of the French Revolution began to gather. At the time of his death, he was known primarily as a craftsman of unusual precision, not as a visionary. His clocks were prized among collectors and clergy, but few people had read his writings. Latin Portos remained unpublished, its pages kept in a box beside his workbench. His will was brief. He left the shop to his nephew. His notes were considered personal and largely ignored. But a curious thing happened over the following decades. As France hurtled toward modernity, through revolution, empire, railways, and telegraphs, the idea of shared, mechanical, measurable time became not just important but necessary. And in 1884, when the world's powers met in Washington, D.C. to adopt Greenwich Mean Time as the global standard, Fargus's name was never mentioned, but in the quiet, it lingers. One of Fargus's surviving clock stands today in the Musée de l'Horlogerie in St. Nicolas de Learmont. It is a tall, slender piece walnut case, brass weights, and a pendulum that swings with understated grace. It bears no fancy ornamentation. But above the dial, carved in Latin, is a phrase no one remembers commissioning: omnibus idem hora. The same hour for all. It's not loud. It doesn't strike the hour with drama, but it ticks. Still. When Fargus died in 1781, France was still a country without a unified time. Each village still followed the sun. Noon was different in Dijon and Rennes. The baker in Avignon began kneading bread at a different hour than the watchmaker in Lille. The bells rang when they pleased, or rather, when the priest pleased, and for a while longer, this remained. Enough. But history, like time, moves forward, even when no one is keeping score. By the end of the century, the French Revolution had swept aside monarchy, tradition, and even the calendar itself. And in that tumult, something strange happened. Fargus's vision re-emerged, not in his name, not in his words, but in the quiet machinery of measurement. In 1793, during the height of revolutionary fever, France introduced the French Republican calendar. The days were renamed, the months reorganized. Time was divided into 10-hour days, each hour made of 100 minutes, and each minute of 100 seconds. It was rational, decimal, uniform. And deeply unpopular. People hated it. Farmers couldn't adjust. Priests refused to follow it. Clocks had to be remade somewhere, but most weren't. After 12 years, the entire system was abandoned. But behind the scenes, another, quieter standard was being pursued. Not revolutionary in style, but practical, infrastructural, and mathematical. France began developing a national telegraph network. It began planning railways. And for those to function, something even more important than political ideology was needed. Standard time. Not just for Paris, not just for Versailles. For everywhere. The true revolution in timekeeping came not from philosophers or kings, but from engineers. By the 1830s and 40s, railways were being laid across France. But they ran into a problem. No one could agree on the hour. A train that left Bordeaux at 10 o'clock might arrive in Paris at 10:45 by one clock, 10:27 by another. Schedules were meaningless without agreement. So, bit by bit, railway time emerged. Each station adjusted its clocks to match Paris time. Then telegraph lines were run between stations. Electric signals were sent to synchronize minute hands. In this system, the state didn't have to enforce time, wires did, and with this, the rhythm Fargus had imagined began to unfold, slowly, reluctantly, inevitably. By 1891, France adopted Paris Mean Time as its official national time standard. And in 1911, it adopted Greenwich Mean Time, aligning with the global standard, but keeping clocks set 9 minutes and 21 seconds ahead to preserve the national rhythm. Fargus was never mentioned. His clocks, where they survived, were now antiques. His writings, unpublished, fragmented, dusty, rested in private collections or obscure archives. His nephew's shop had long since become a bakery, and then a barber's, but the ideas he shaped with brass and wood had been absorbed by the century that followed him. Not through fame, through function. In 1953, during a reorganization of a horological museum in St. Nicolas de Learmont, a curator discovered a set of papers tucked inside the back panel of a long case clock. The writing was faded. The dialect was archaic. The ink had bled into the fibers. It took weeks to decipher. What they found were diagrams, notations, and a short essay titled Le Battement d'une Nation, The Beating of a Nation. It was Fargus, writing not to scholars, but to himself. Each town has a bell, each bell has a man. Each man listens to his bell, and not to the next. So they live like limbs without a heart. But if all bells strike together, perhaps we would feel the body of France breathing again. It was part metaphor, part meditation, and entirely modern. The long view of precision. Fargus had no way of knowing what would come. He didn't foresee digital watches, atomic clocks, or satellites pulsing signals to billions of smartphones. He didn't anticipate traffic lights, broadcast schedules, or global markets depending on millisecond trades. But he saw something else. He saw that time was not a natural law, at least. Not in the way people lived it. It was a shared illusion, kept stable by machines, rules, and trust. And that illusion could bind a nation together more quietly, more thoroughly, than any royal decree. He built his clocks not to impress, but to synchronize. And that idea that human society functions better when we share a common rhythm has only grown more true. In the end, Fargus wasn't a genius or a prophet. He was a man who made very good clocks and asked very patient questions. What is time? Who decides it? What happens when no one agrees? And in asking those questions, he helped sow the seeds of a transformation that would shape how we all live today. Not through revolution, through calibration, through pendulums and springs, through clocks that tick even when no one is watching.